The night my brother told me I should move out, I was standing in the kitchen portioning leftovers into plastic containers, doing it carefully the way I always had, as if order could still hold everything together. My fingers ached from the cold and from age. I was 55 years old. My brother was 60. Neither of us was young enough to pretend starting over would be easy, yet he said the words as if I could simply pack a bag and step into a brand new life waiting outside the door. He leaned against the counter, not looking at me directly. His voice was calm, measured, already decided. The kids are grown now. Laura and I can manage. You should think about yourself. I nodded. I didn't trust my voice. I sealed one container, then another, because my hands knew what to do even when my heart didn't. I asked if he wanted soup for tomorrow. He hesitated before saying no, and that hesitation told me everything. I was no longer necessary. I was no longer part of the plan. Upstairs, the kids were in their rooms. One was scrolling on her phone, the other pretending to study. They were old enough now to sense when something was wrong, but young enough to believe adults always knew what they were doing. I didn't want them to hear my voice break, so I carried the containers to the fridge, wiped the counter, and walked down the hall to the small bedroom that had never quite felt like mine. I sat on the edge of the bed and peeled the pain patch off my lower back. I'd been using them for years. The dull, constant ache had become part of me, the kind that comes from decades of bending, lifting, carrying. Not just groceries or laundry, but other people's lives. I looked at myself in the mirror. A 55-year-old woman stared back. Grey threaded through my hair, fine lines around my eyes, a face shaped by responsibility rather than choice. 19 years earlier, I had been 46 when my brother called me in the middle of the night. His voice didn't sound like him. It was fractured, hollow, barely holding together. His wife had died of cancer in less than 6 months. One moment she was tired, the next she was gone. He was 41 then. With 2 young children and a house full of grief he didn't know how to manage. At that time, I had a life of my own. It wasn't glamorous, but it was mine. I worked as an accountant for a small firm. I rented a modest apartment. I had been divorced for years and had finally reached a quiet place where my days felt predictable, stable. I had no children, no one depending on me. For the first time in a long while, I felt like I could breathe. Then my brother called. He didn't beg. He didn't have to. He said he didn't know how to do this alone. He didn't know how to get the kids to school, how to cook, how to keep everything from collapsing. I told him I would come help for a while, just until things settled down. I packed a small suitcase. A few weeks turned into months. The kids couldn't sleep unless I was there. My brother forgot to eat, forgot to pay bills, forgot appointments. I took over without anyone formally asking. I quit my job temporarily, telling myself I would return once the household stabilized. My company replaced me. I told myself that was fine. There would be other jobs. There would be time later. There was always a reason to stay. One child had nightmares. The other struggled at school. My brother sank deeper into himself, working longer hours, coming home exhausted and silent. I cooked, cleaned, drove, attended school meetings, helped with homework, held the kids when they cried. I handled the details that made life possible. I didn't give birth to those children, but I was there for everything that mattered. My brother went to work. People praised him for being strong, for carrying on after such a loss. No one mentioned me. I didn't correct them. I believed my sacrifice was understood, even if it wasn't acknowledged. Years passed. The children grew. I aged quietly, not just in years, but in spirit. I stopped buying new clothes. I stopped traveling. I stopped imagining a future that included anything beyond the next responsibility. Dating felt impossible. Who would want a woman in her 50s, living in her brother's house, raising his children. Sometimes the kids called me Mom by accident. I corrected them gently. My brother laughed. I didn't. I lived in a space without a name, no longer just a sister, never quite a parent, something in between that carried all the weight without the recognition. Then Laura came into our lives. She was my age, organized, confident. She had opinions about everything and a way of speaking that made her sound reasonable, even when she was quietly claiming territory. At first, she praised me endlessly, told people how much I had sacrificed, how the family couldn't have survived without me. But I noticed how she looked at me, as if she were assessing how much space I took up and how difficult it would be to remove me. She changed the house little by little, rearranged furniture, took over cooking, inserted herself into routines I had built over years. She spoke about resetting the family and creating healthy boundaries. What I heard was replacement. My brother didn't object. Maybe he didn't notice. Or maybe he had already decided that my role had an expiration date. And then, at 60 years old, after nearly 2 decades of my life spent holding his together, he told me I should go live my own life. What life? That night, lying in the narrow bed I had slept in for years, listening to the house settle around me, I felt something deeper than sadness. I felt unease. Because when someone pushes you out after you've given them everything, it isn't just about independence. It's about what they need to do once you're gone. The morning after he told me to leave, I woke before dawn out of habit. My body didn't know how to stop yet. I lay there for a few seconds, listening to the house breathe, the low hum of the refrigerator, the faint creak of the floor as someone upstairs shifted in their sleep. For years, those sounds had been my reassurance that everything was still standing. That morning, they felt like a countdown. I got up quietly and made coffee. I used my own mug, the one with the small chip on the rim that Laura never touched. I stood at the kitchen window watching the sky lighten, thinking about how many mornings I had started this way. Thousands. I had planned entire days around other people's needs before the sun even rose, and now suddenly there was nowhere I was expected to be. Laura came down first. She smiled at me, polite, contained. "Good morning," she said, as if nothing had happened. I nodded back. I didn't trust myself to speak. She poured herself coffee, moved easily around the kitchen, opening drawers without hesitation. I realized then how completely she already belonged here, and how quietly I was being edged out. When my brother came down, he avoided my eyes. He talked about errands, about the kids' schedules, about ordinary things, as if repeating them could make everything normal again. No one mentioned my leaving directly. It was already assumed. The kids came down later, sleepy and distracted. They kissed my cheek out of habit. One of them asked if I'd be home for dinner. My brother answered before I could. "She might be busy tonight." Might be, not won't, not yes. Just erased from the equation. After breakfast, I went back to my room and closed the door. I sat on the bed and looked around. The room held very little that was truly mine. Clothes folded carefully, a few framed photos, a small box of papers I had carried from place to place without ever opening. I pulled it out and set it on the bed. Inside were pieces of the life I'd paused. Old bank statements, documents from my old job, a notebook with dance class schedules scribbled in the margins, remnants from before everything changed. At the bottom was a folder I didn't recognize at first. My brother's name was on it. I frowned and opened it. Inside were copies of financial documents, mortgage statements, insurance papers, power of attorney forms. Some of them had my signature on them. Others didn't. My stomach tightened as I flipped through the pages. I remembered now. Years earlier, when everything was chaos, my brother had asked me to help organize paperwork. He had said it was temporary, just in case something happened to him. I trusted him. I signed where he told me to sign. I filed things away without reading closely. I was too busy keeping the house running, too busy making sure the kids survived their grief. Now, reading more carefully, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to consider before. My name wasn't just on helper documents. It was on liabilities. I sat there for a long time, heart pounding, reading each page slowly. Certain loans had been refinanced years ago, with me listed as a co-signer. Credit lines had been opened, closed, reopened. There were balances I didn't recognize, amounts far larger than I expected. My brother had been careful. Nothing was outright illegal, nothing obvious. But everything pointed to one uncomfortable truth. I hadn't just given him my time. I had given him my financial stability. And now, just as Laura was settling in, just as the kids were grown, just as his life was finally under control, he wanted me gone. The realization hit me like cold water. I wasn't being dismissed because I was no longer useful to the family. I was being dismissed because I was no longer safe. Later that afternoon, Laura knocked on my door. "We should talk," she said. I gestured for her to come in. She sat on the edge of the bed, perfectly composed. "I know this transition is hard," she began, "but it's healthier for everyone if boundaries are clear." Boundaries. The word tasted bitter. "I don't want you to feel pushed out," she continued, "but Daniel and I are building something together. It's time. Time. Another word people use when they don't want to say replacement. I looked at her then, really looked. The calm certainty in her eyes, the confidence of someone who knew exactly where she stood. "I've been here almost 20 years, I said quietly. She nodded. "And you've done so much, truly. But that doesn't mean this can't change." Change. Always framed as progress, never as loss. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake thinking about every signature I'd ever written, every decision I'd deferred because I trusted my brother. I thought about how easily care turns into control when you stop paying attention, how love can blur lines until you don't realize you've crossed them. The next morning I called a lawyer. I hadn't planned to. I hadn't even known who to call. But something inside me had shifted. Fear, maybe, or instinct. I told him everything. About the years I lived there, the documents, the request for me to leave. He listened quietly, then asked a question that made my throat tighten. "Did your brother ever compensate you for your time?" "No," I said. "Did you ever have a formal agreement?" "No." He paused. "Then what you gave him," he said carefully, "wasn't just help. It was labor and financial exposure." After the call, I sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the table I had cleaned 1,000 times. For the first time, I didn't feel confused. I felt alert. That evening, my brother told me they were thinking it would be best if I moved out within the month. I nodded again. But this time, something was different. This time, I was listening. The day after I spoke to the lawyer, I moved through the house differently. I still cooked, still cleaned, still folded laundry the way I always had. But inside, something had hardened. I was no longer drifting inside my own life. I was watching. I noticed how Laura handled the mail now, how she set aside certain envelopes before my brother ever saw them. I noticed how conversation stopped when I entered a room, then resumed with forced casualness once I sat down. I noticed how my brother had begun referring to things as mine and hers instead of ours, a word he had used freely for years when it suited him. That afternoon, I drove to the bank. I told myself I was just going to ask questions. That's all. No accusations, no assumptions, just clarity. The young man behind the desk smiled politely as he pulled up the accounts tied to my name. His expression changed slightly as he scrolled. "There are several obligations here," he said. "You're listed as co-signer on 2 loans and a line of credit." "I didn't take out any loans," I said. He nodded. but you're legally responsible for them." My mouth went dry. He turned the screen toward me and explained the numbers, the amounts, the timelines. Loans refinanced years ago. Credit extended, rolled over, increased. All done during the years I had lived in that house, years when I was too busy raising his children to scrutinize paperwork. Years when trust had replaced caution. I drove home slowly, hands tight on the steering wheel, heart pounding, not with anger, but with a deep, shaking understanding. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't an accident. This was a slow transfer of risk. That night, my brother sat across from me at dinner, eating the meal I had cooked, talking about his plans for retirement. Laura chimed in, mentioning downsizing, travel, freedom, a future that did not include me. I set my fork down. "There's something I need to ask you," I said. He stiffened immediately. Laura's smile faded just enough to notice. "Why am I listed as co-signer on your loans?" The silence that followed was heavy. My brother looked at Laura. Laura looked back at him. Then she leaned forward slightly as if taking control of the moment. "It was practical," she said. "At the time." "At the time," I repeated. "You were living here," she continued. "You were part of the household. It made sense." "It made sense," I said, again, my voice steady even as my chest tightened, to tie my financial future to debts I didn't know about. My brother finally spoke. "You said you trusted me." I stared at him. "I trusted you with my life," I said, "not with my ruin." He looked away. That was the moment something broke between us. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, permanently. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Laura stopped pretending. She spoke to me like an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. She reminded me often that the house was in my brother's name, that I had no legal claim to living there, that my staying had always been temporary. 19 years. My brother avoided confrontation. He let her speak for him. He let her reframe the narrative until I was no longer the woman who saved his family, but a burden he had carried too long. When I told him I was consulting a lawyer, his face drained of colour. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm finally seeing it for what it is." That night, I packed a suitcase, not because I was ready to leave, but because I wanted to see how it felt to choose myself, even in small ways. I folded my clothes carefully, my hands steady. I packed the few personal items I couldn't bear to lose. The rest I left behind. The next morning, Laura noticed. "You're leaving?" she asked, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "Soon?" I said. She smiled, but she didn't know what I had already set in motion. Within a week, my lawyer had confirmed what I suspected. I had grounds, not just emotionally, but legally. Years of unpaid labour, financial entanglement without informed consent, documents signed under pressure during a period of emotional crisis. He asked me what I wanted. The question stunned me. No one had asked me that in years. "I want my name off everything," I said, "and I want compensation for what I gave." When the formal letter arrived at the house, my brother finally panicked. He came to my room late that night, eyes red, voice shaking. "You're going to destroy me," he said. I looked at him, really looked. The man I had protected for nearly 2 decades. "I protected you," I replied. "You used me." He sank onto the edge of the bed, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't think it would come to this." "Neither did I said. The kids found out soon after. They were confused, hurt, angry. They asked why I was leaving, why everything felt different. I told them the truth, gently, that sometimes adults make choices that cost more than they realize. The oldest cried. The youngest hugged me tightly, as if afraid I might disappear mid-embrace. Laura watched it all from the doorway, arms crossed. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage after the play had ended, everyone scrambling to rewrite the ending. I moved into a small apartment across town 2 weeks later. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. It was mine. The legal process began shortly after, and with it, the unravelling of a story my brother had hoped would stay buried. The day after I spoke to the lawyer, I moved through the house differently. I still cooked, still cleaned, still folded laundry the way I always had. But inside, something had hardened. I was no longer drifting inside my own life. I was watching. I noticed how Laura handled the mail now, how she set aside certain envelopes before my brother ever saw them. I noticed how conversation stopped when I entered a room, then resumed with forced casualness once I sat down. I noticed how my brother had begun referring to things as mine and hers instead of ours, a word he had used freely for years when it suited him. That afternoon, I drove to the bank. I told myself I was just going to ask questions. That's all. No accusations, no assumptions, just clarity. The young man behind the desk smiled politely as he pulled up the accounts tied to my name. His expression changed slightly as he scrolled. "There are several obligations here," he said. "You're listed as co-signer on 2 loans and a line of credit." "I didn't take out any loans," I said. He nodded. "But you're legally responsible for them." My mouth went dry. He turned the screen toward me and explained the numbers, the amounts, the timelines. Loans refinanced years ago. Credit extended, rolled over, increased. All done during the years I had lived in that house, years when I was too busy raising his children to scrutinize paperwork. Years when trust had replaced caution. I drove home slowly, hands tight on the steering wheel, heart pounding, not with anger, but with a deep, shaking understanding. This wasn't an oversight. This wasn't an accident. This was a slow transfer of risk. That night, my brother sat across from me at dinner, eating the meal I had cooked, talking about his plans for retirement. Laura chimed in, mentioning downsizing, travel, freedom, a future that did not include me. I set my fork down. "There's something I need to ask you," I said. He stiffened immediately. Laura's smile faded just enough to notice. "Why am I listed as co-signer on your loans?" The silence that followed was heavy. My brother looked at Laura. Laura looked back at him. Then she leaned forward slightly as if taking control of the moment. "It was practical," she said. "At the time." "At the time," I repeated. "You were living here," she continued. "You were part of the household. It made sense." "It made sense," I said, again, my voice steady even as my chest tightened, to tie my financial future to debts I didn't know about. My brother finally spoke. "You said you trusted me." I stared at him. "I trusted you with my life," I said, "not with my ruin." He looked away. That was the moment something broke between us. Not loudly, not dramatically, quietly, permanently. Over the next few days, things escalated quickly. Laura stopped pretending. She spoke to me like an inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. She reminded me often that the house was in my brother's name, that I had no legal claim to living there, that my staying had always been temporary. 19 years. My brother avoided confrontation. He let her speak for him. He let her reframe the narrative until I was no longer the woman who saved his family, but a burden he had carried too long. When I told him I was consulting a lawyer, his face drained of colour. "You're making this into something it doesn't have to be," he said. "No," I replied. "I'm finally seeing it for what it is." That night, I packed a suitcase, not because I was ready to leave, but because I wanted to see how it felt to choose myself, even in small ways. I folded my clothes carefully, my hands steady. I packed the few personal items I couldn't bear to lose. The rest I left behind. The next morning, Laura noticed. "You're leaving?" she asked, a flicker of triumph in her eyes. "Soon?" I said. She smiled. But she didn't know what I had already set in motion. Within a week, my lawyer had confirmed what I suspected. I had grounds, not just emotionally, but legally. Years of unpaid labour, financial entanglement without informed consent, documents signed under pressure during a period of emotional crisis. He asked me what I wanted. The question stunned me. No one had asked me that in years. I want my name off everything, I said, and I want compensation for what I gave. When the formal letter arrived at the house, my brother finally panicked. He came to my room late that night, eyes red, voice shaking. "You're going to destroy me," he said. I looked at him, really looked. The man I had protected for nearly 2 decades. "I protected you," I replied. "You used me." He sank onto the edge of the bed, his shoulders sagging. "I didn't think it would come to this." "Neither did I said. The kids found out soon after. They were confused, hurt, angry. They asked why I was leaving, why everything felt different. I told them the truth, gently, that sometimes adults make choices that cost more than they realize. The oldest cried. The youngest hugged me tightly, as if afraid I might disappear mid-embrace. Laura watched it all from the doorway, arms crossed. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a stage after the play had ended, everyone scrambling to rewrite the ending. I moved into a small apartment across town 2 weeks later. It wasn't much, but it was quiet. It was mine. The legal process began shortly after, and with it, the unravelling of a story my brother had hoped would stay buried. The apartment smelled like fresh paint and loneliness. I slept on a mattress on the floor the first night, surrounded by half-unpacked boxes, listening to unfamiliar sounds from the street below. Cars passing. A dog barking somewhere. No footsteps overhead. No one calling my name. For the first time in nearly 20 years, the silence belonged to me alone. I thought I would feel relief, freedom. Instead, I felt unanchored, like a piece of furniture dragged out into the rain after serving its purpose. I woke with my heart racing, reaching instinctively for a routine that no longer existed. There were no lunches to pack, no schedules to manage, no quiet crises waiting for me to fix them before anyone else noticed. But there was also something else beneath the grief. Anger, clean and sharp. The legal process moved slowly at first, then all at once. My lawyer requested documentation, bank records, loan histories, timelines. I spent hours going through old files, emails, faded paperwork I had never thought to question before. Each document felt like another layer of skin being peeled back, exposing just how deeply my life had been woven into my brother's without my full understanding or consent. The numbers were worse than I expected. Years of unpaid labour, calculated conservatively, still amounted to more than my entire savings. The co-signed loans had ballooned quietly, refinanced again and again to keep payments manageable. For him, not for me. My credit score had been slowly eroded, inch by inch, while I was busy raising his children and holding his household together. When my brother received the formal notice detailing my claims, he called me immediately. "You blindsided me," he said. His voice sounded old, smaller than I remembered. "I spent 2 decades being blindsided," I replied. He tried anger first, then guilt, then nostalgia. He reminded me of holidays, of shared laughter, of everything we had survived together. He told me I was tearing the family apart. Laura never spoke to me directly again. Everything came through lawyers. Her warmth vanished entirely, replaced by cold precision. She wanted this resolved quickly, quietly. She did not want scrutiny. The kids called me. At first every day, then less often, unsure of where loyalty was supposed to land. I never spoke badly about their father. I told them the truth without cruelty, that I had loved them, still loved them, but that I had to protect myself now. "I didn't know," my nephew said once, his voice thick with shame. I thought you just stayed. So did I said. Mediation was scheduled before court. Sitting across from my brother in a neutral room felt surreal. He looked tired, older than 60. For the first time, he looked like someone who had run out of options. His lawyer spoke about misunderstandings, about blurred lines, about family arrangements that evolve. My lawyer spoke about documentation, about consent, about exploitation, dressed as devotion. When it was my turn to speak, my voice surprised me. It didn't shake. I didn't ask for payment, I said. I asked for respect. I asked for honesty. What I got was silence and debt. My brother stared at the table. The settlement offer came 2 weeks later. It wasn't everything I was owed. It never could be. But it was enough. My name was removed from all financial obligations. I received compensation that allowed me to breathe again, not extravagantly, but safely. Laura insisted on a non-disclosure agreement. She didn't want this story circulating. I agreed, not for her, but because I was tired. When it was over, truly over, I cried for the first time since leaving the house. Not loud, heaving sobs, just quiet tears sliding down my face as I sat on the floor of my apartment, my back against the wall, finally letting myself feel the loss. I had lost years, a version of myself, a family I believed was mine. But I had also gained something I hadn't felt in a long time, clarity. The kids came to see me one by one over the following months, carefully, tentatively. We rebuilt something smaller but real. No obligations, no blurred lines, just choice. My brother and I spoke only once more months later. He apologized, not fully, not the way I needed, but enough to tell me he understood something had been broken beyond repair. I didn't know how to let you go, he said. You never asked, I replied. At 55, I began again. Not loudly, not dramatically, but deliberately. I found part-time work. I took long walks. I slept. I learned what it meant to exist without being needed. Some nights I still missed the house, the noise, the illusion of belonging. But I never missed the way I disappeared inside it. The months that followed were quiet, in a way I wasn't used to. Not peaceful at first, just empty. Silence has weight when you've spent most of your adult life anticipating other people's needs. I kept catching myself standing up for no reason, convinced I'd forgotten something important. A permission slip, a dentist appointment, dinner. Then I would remember there was no one waiting for me to remember anymore. I started working part-time at a small bookkeeping firm recommended by a former colleague who barely recognized me at first. I didn't blame her. I had aged in a way that doesn't show clearly in photographs, slow erosion rather than sudden change. The work was simple, grounding, numbers made sense. They didn't ask for love, they didn't blur boundaries. Some evenings, I would sit at my small kitchen table with a cup of tea and feel an unexpected wave of grief hit me out of nowhere. Not just for the years I'd lost, but for the woman I had been before I learned to disappear so well. I mourned her the way you mourn someone who moved away without saying goodbye. The kids began visiting again, cautiously. At first they asked permission, as if I were the one who might turn them away. We talked about neutral things, school, work, friends. Eventually the conversations grew heavier. I didn't know you were paying for things, my niece said one afternoon, staring into her coffee. Dad never talked about it. I didn't talk about it either, I replied. That's how it happened. She looked up at me then, eyes sharp with adult understanding. That wasn't fair to you? No one had ever said that out loud before. The words landed softly but changed something inside me. My nephew was quieter. He apologized once, awkwardly, for not noticing sooner. I told him there was nothing to forgive. Children shouldn't have to see what adults refuse to look at. Still, I saw the guilt sit heavy on his shoulders, And I hated that this truth reached him so late. Laura never reached out. I didn't expect her to. But through the children, I learned that things at the house weren't as smooth as she'd promised. Retirement plans stalled. Money felt tighter. My absence wasn't just emotional. It had been structural. I had been the glue, the buffer, the invisible labour that made everything look effortless. Without me, the cracks showed. My brother tried calling once, late at night. I didn't answer. He left a message instead, his voice tentative, almost unfamiliar. He said he missed me, that the house felt different, that he hadn't realised how much I did. I listened to it twice, then deleted it, not out of cruelty, but because I finally understood that acknowledgement after damage isn't the same as accountability. I began therapy a few months later, not because I was broken, but because I was tired of carrying truths alone. I learned words I hadn't had before: enmeshment, caregiver burnout, financial abuse without intent. It was strange hearing my life described in clean clinical terms, but it helped me separate my worth from my role. One afternoon, my therapist asked me a simple question: if no one ever needs you again, who are you? I didn't have an answer. That realization scared me more than anything my brother had done. So I started small. I joined a walking group for women over 50. I took a painting class at the community centre, not because I was good at it, but because I wanted to be bad at something without consequences. I laughed more than I expected to. I felt awkward, alive. For the first time in decades, my time belonged to me. A year passed, then another. My relationship with the kids settled into something honest. We celebrated birthdays, had quiet dinners. I showed up because I wanted to, not because I was responsible. The difference mattered. My brother and I remained distant, cordial when necessary, strangers with shared history. I stopped waiting for the apology I deserved. Some people never learn how to say the right words, only how to regret them quietly. One evening, as I was walking home from work, I passed a mirror in a shop window and caught my reflection by accident. I stopped, looked, really looked. I was older, yes, but I stood straighter. My eyes were clearer. I didn't look like someone waiting to be told where she belonged. I thought about the years I had given, the love, the exhaustion, the silence, and I realized something that surprised me. I didn't regret loving them. I regretted forgetting myself, because sacrifice should be a choice, not a trap. Love should expand you, not erase you, and family should never require you to disappear so others can feel whole. At 55, I didn't get my old life back, but I finally got my own. The second year after I left was the hardest in a quieter way. The crisis had passed. The legal fight was over. There were no more urgent decisions to make. And that was exactly when the emptiness crept in. Not loud enough to fight, not sharp enough to demand attention, just persistent. When you spend most of your adult life being needed, losing that role feels less like freedom and more like invisibility. Some mornings, I woke up and lay still, staring at the ceiling of my apartment, unsure why my chest felt so heavy. Nothing was wrong. Bills were paid. Work was steady. My health for my age was acceptable. But there was a dull grief that had no obvious trigger. I realized then that I wasn't just mourning what my brother had taken from me. I was mourning the identity I had built around giving. For years, people had known me as the reliable one, the one who stepped in, the one who never complained, the one who held everything together quietly. Without that role, I felt shapeless, undefined, as if my value had been erased along with my duties. Therapy helped, but slowly. My therapist said something once that stayed with me. When caregiving becomes your entire sense of self, healing feels like selfishness. That sentence hit me harder than any accusation my brother had ever made. I began noticing how often I apologized for existing, for taking up space, for saying no. I caught myself offering help I didn't have the energy to give, just to feel useful again. Old habits die hard, especially the ones built on fear of abandonment. One afternoon, I received a call from my niece. She was crying. Her parents were arguing constantly now, she said, about money, about retirement, about things that had apparently never been an issue before. I sat on the edge of my couch, phone pressed to my ear, and felt a complicated mix of emotions rise in me. Sadness for her, anger for myself, and an uncomfortable truth I didn't want to name. My absence had consequences. I hadn't just been emotional support. I had been labour. I had been organisation. I had been stability. Without me, the family system had to confront realities it had avoided for years. I wanted to fix it. The instinct was immediate and powerful, to step back in, to smooth things over, to help them find their footing again. But I didn't. Instead, I listened. I comforted her. I told her I loved her. And when she asked if I could talk to her father, I said gently, "That's something he and Laura need to work through." Hanging up, my hand shook. Saying no still felt dangerous, but I also felt something else. Pride. Not the loud kind, the quiet kind that comes from choosing not to abandon yourself. A few weeks later, my brother called again, this time during the day. I let it ring twice before answering. He sounded tired, not angry, not defensive, just worn down. "I didn't realise how much you handled," he said. "Everything feels harder now." I waited. "I'm not asking you to come back," he added quickly. "I just wanted you to know." There it was, the closest he would ever come to admitting the truth. "I know," I said, and I meant it. After the call ended, I sat for a long time in silence. I wasn't relieved. I wasn't vindicated. I was simply done. Done hoping he would finally understand in a way that could undo the damage. Some lessons arrive too late to repair what they break. That summer, I took my first real vacation in over 20 years. Nothing extravagant. A small coastal town a few hours away. I booked a modest room overlooking the water. On the first morning, I sat on the balcony wrapped in a thin blanket, watching the sun rise over the ocean, and cried without knowing exactly why. It felt like standing at the edge of a life I had never allowed myself to imagine. I walked along the beach every day. I ate when I was hungry, slept when I was tired. I spoke to strangers without explaining myself. No one there knew my history. No one expected anything from me. For the first time in decades, I felt anonymous and free. When I returned, something had shifted. I stopped measuring my days by productivity. I stopped explaining my past to justify my present. I let myself exist without a role. The kids noticed the change when they visited. "You seem lighter," my nephew said once. I smiled. "I am." My niece asked me one evening if I regretted staying as long as I did. The question was careful, respectful, heavy with concern. I thought about it for a long time before answering. "No," I said, "but I regret not leaving sooner." She nodded, understanding more than I wished she had to. As I approached 57, I began to think differently about the years ahead. Not as something to endure, but as something to shape. Slowly, intentionally, I updated my will, organised my finances, made choices with my own future in mind. Not out of fear, but out of self-respect. Sometimes, late at night, memories still surfaced. The sound of the kids laughing down the hallway, the rhythm of a house full of life. I allowed myself to miss it without romanticising it, because I finally understood the difference between belonging and being used. Belonging doesn't require silence. Belonging doesn't demand self-erasure. Belonging doesn't end the moment you stop being useful. What I had given my brother wasn't wrong, but what he took without question was, and learning that, Accepting it was the final step in reclaiming myself. By the time I turned 58, the story I had lived for nearly 2 decades no longer felt like it was still happening to me. It felt finished. Not erased, not forgiven, but closed, like a heavy door I had finally locked behind me. Life settled into something quieter, sturdier. I moved to a slightly larger apartment with more light. I bought a real bed instead of the temporary one I'd promised myself I wouldn't get attached to. I planted herbs on the windowsill and learned which one survived neglect, which needed daily care. That felt symbolic somehow. My work expanded, not dramatically, but steadily. I became someone people relied on again, but this time with boundaries. I clocked out. I said no when I was tired. I let mistakes belong to others instead of absorbing them automatically. Every small refusal felt like reclaiming a piece of myself. The children, young adults now, found their own rhythms. We didn't pretend nothing had happened. We didn't dissect it endlessly either. Our relationship shifted from dependence to choice, and that made it real in a way it had never been before. They visited. They called. They included me. Not because I was the foundation holding everything up, but because they wanted me there. That mattered more than I expected. My brother and I spoke less and less. There was no dramatic final confrontation, no explosive apology, just distance that settled into permanence. I stopped waiting for him to become the man who would fully acknowledge what he had done. Some people can live their whole lives benefiting from someone else's sacrifice without ever learning how to name it. That realization no longer made me angry. It made me free. One afternoon, I was sorting through old papers when I found a photograph tucked inside a book. It was from years ago. Me standing in the kitchen, younger, smiling, without realizing how tired my eyes looked. A child's arm was wrapped around my waist, trusting, casual. I stared at it for a long time. I didn't feel bitterness. I felt compassion. For the woman who thought love meant endurance. For the woman who believed being indispensable was the same as being valued. For the woman who didn't know she was allowed to leave. I put the photo back, not in a place of honor, but not in the trash either. Some parts of our lives deserve to be remembered without being relived. That winter, my brother fell ill. Nothing dramatic. A scare, not a tragedy. The kids called me, worried, unsure of what to do. I offered advice. I listened. I did not rush back. I did not step into the role I had outgrown, and nothing fell apart. That was when I knew, without question, that leaving had been the right decision. At 59, I stopped introducing myself through what I had done for others. I didn't explain my past unless I wanted to. I learned to sit with myself without apologizing for the space I occupied. I allowed my life to be smaller, but truer. People sometimes ask if I regret not having children of my own. I tell them the truth. I regret believing that loving others required abandoning myself. I don't regret the love. I regret the silence I kept around it. Because love, real love, should never require you to disappear quietly so someone else can feel comfortable. It should never leave you older, poorer, and questioning your worth while others move on unburdened. What I learned, too late, but not uselessly, is this. Sacrifice without consent becomes theft. Loyalty without limits becomes exploitation. And family that only values you when you are useful is not family. It is dependency dressed up as love. Today my life is not impressive, but it is mine. I wake up without dread. I go to sleep without resentment. I make plans without asking permission. I rest without guilt. I exist without explanation, and that is enough. In the end, I didn't lose my family when I walked away. I lost the version of myself that believed I had to stay. Thank you for staying with me until the end. If this story touched you in any way, I'm truly grateful you were here. These experiences aren't easy to share, but knowing someone listened makes them feel lighter. Your time, your presence, and your understanding mean more than you know.